I joined the game in November 6th of 2013. Now, I have been told that you are not allowed to like this game if you do not like story. Obviously, I feel differently. I have found that across the thousands of hours, I think this morning I checked it, it was something over 4, less than 5,000 hours in this game. So I would say that for every hour I've put into the game, even if I had paid attention to story instead of skipped it, I would have multiple times that doing something else. And so when I hear that the game isn't good without story, I think it insults everybody that has worked on Final Fantasy XIV as a game, all the developers and community team members whose job is not to put story in game. And so I get really hurt when I'm told that my method of playing and that their contribution to the game is not valid without the people who work on and enjoy story. But I started in Shadowbringers and had an absolute blast. And then I got into Endwalker. Obviously, I was aware that a lot of things flew over my head. I don't know what all this Omega stuff is and all that, so I've been going back through. And I've been posting that whole journey of me fully voice acting it, getting immersed. That's all been getting posted over on Gaming Lore, kinda. But I've had fun my way. I don't regret how I got here, and anybody who wants to play and have fun and not hurt somebody else's fun, I'm in. But we've been having this conversation a lot lately. And there has been a post by Quazii. And so I don't really know what this post is about, but I find Quazii does a pretty good job of representing all the best parts of the game, and representing them in a very positive way. And so I wanted to listen to that side as somebody that did care from the story right from the get-go, because that's not the point of view I come from. And I think that if you're playing an MMO and you're enjoying it and you're not hurting anybody else, you're doing it correctly.
Hey folks, today I'd like to talk about what you see on screen here. Essentially, OP positions the question as, do you feel like the Final Fantasy XIV story is blown way out of proportion? The important bits are essentially what's highlighted. To be clear, I think what OP is trying to say is that this is definitely not the best story that someone has experienced in a video game, and that there's a lot of failed emotional moments, boring scenes and dragged out story arcs. However, OP does conclude that the story is still pretty good. It's just not as crazy good as what people make it out to be. That said, I think if you look through the thread, and the first main point I'd like to bring up is that the 14 storyline and MSQs isn't amazing to me personally, just simply because of the narrative and the storyline. In a vacuum, the story itself is, as per what OP characterized, is a pretty good story. But that's not the big picture here. And I'll explain that shortly, but think about it. The storyline of Final Fantasy XIV throughout the many years that concluded with Endwalker for the first saga is pretty much, if you go through any form of formal written training regarding like writing essays and expositions, it follows a standard formula, right? However, I think what makes the MSQ experience to me amazing, nothing like I've experienced in other video games, is that aside from the narrative itself, there are other elements that other video games are not able to replicate. And amongst them is the music. I think if you watch any blockbuster movie, if you watch anything that has moved you in the past, and if you remove the musical background track, I can pretty much assure and guarantee you the feels of the emotions that you're going through will not be as intense.
We actually had to do this in school. I think it was for maybe a theater class, so I don't know where you buy these, but they had a copy of maybe a Star Wars film. So something that was very dramatic and had big action scenes, and it had the music track removed. Everything else was still in. All the same VFX, all the same, you know, everything, all those little added sounds for people's footsteps and all that, that there are different people within the movie industry that add that because the actual recording on set doesn't make the right noise. All of that was still in. All of the voice was still in, but there was no music. And it lost a lot. So it's interesting that he brings this up as a point, because I'm seeing the contrast as I've gone back. Post Endwalker, I'm going back and re-clearing, and through Realm Reborn and Heaven's Word, I find that the zone music is just not that immersive. It feels like a decent track on a loop, and actually sometimes the track turns off, and then it just waits a while and kind of kicks back on. And so it's less constant. And so when I'm like streaming me like leveling in those zones or something like that, as I've gone back on my main character to try to grind some old achievements, it's almost back to the way I've always played MMOs. Turn off the BGM, go turn on something like Lo-Fi Girl, or if I'm not streaming, some top 40 crap, whatever I like, it's fine. You know, a Josh Strafe Hayes video, podcast, it doesn't matter because the audio's not part of it. As opposed to when I play games that have a more constant sound engineer's direction, like I've been playing a lot of Call of Duty lately. Call of Duty, I find sound is incredibly important to what it adds to the game, and so I do want that sound on, and I don't want other background noises, and I don't listen to other background noises. And Shadowbringers and Endwalker are much closer to that. The music that Soken and his team have put in is absolutely incredible, but when you back up, it ends up being more like Guild Wars or World of Warcraft, where the music's good, but you could pick that music up and put it in any other game, and it would be fine. And you could play the game without that music, and it would be fine. And so there's this idea that when I was in school, we had to study kind of what makes a building a great building. And its site is a key part of that. You can't just pick it up and locate it anywhere. And what makes a building timeless is that it's very of its time. Ironically, you don't design something to be timeless. What makes something timeless is how of its time it is. And so its sense of place and its sense of time are incredibly important. And I think Shadowbringers and Endwalker nails that and will hold up to the test of time as a result. But ARR, Heavensward, and Stormblood content, when I'm in those zones, that music doesn't have to be there, and those zones don't have to have that specific music. And so that is something that is later in the story, but to somebody who gets into Quazi's content, decides to download the game, I assume there are many, that's something that builds over time. It's not there the entire way through.
Because like they say, music is kind of like the window into the soul. It is what orchestrates your emotions and tells you what to feel. And in Soken-san, Yoshi P arguably has one of the best musical talent, I guess, in the video gaming history or in this generation. Because look around for other MMOs. You will find other great musical composers, but I will argue none are as versatile as what Soken can do, which is basically he can do jazz, he can do grand epic orchestral music, he can do piano sentimental music, guitar acousticals, and basically the range and repertoire is just insane, right? Let's look at Lahi and his performance using the otome at, one of the FanFest.
Actually, if you go listen to Endwalker's soundtrack, compared to Shadowbringers, it's very little original music to the game, in that like a lot of it is a genre change to an existing set of notes. So it's like when a rap song gets remixed as a country song or the other way around, like it's a genre jump, which is a different talent. So the fact that he can write this truly original music that captures something, and then in the expansion Endwalker, which is part of Endwalker's objective, was to make callbacks. So the fact that a ton of Endwalker music was a callback is not a, they didn't even make original music for Endwalker, bro. It is intentional. It is reestablishing a motif or like a callback to a specific moment that we've had in the past. And it's a brilliant use of music to take you into somewhere new and make you feel something you already felt.
And I remember there was an interview done with either Yoshi P or Soken where they actually said that one of the polishing elements for, shipping the final expansion is that they have to basically trim the musical scores to fit the cutscene exactly down to the very second. And why do you think they do that? It's really to ensure that the music kicks in at the exact right moment. The pacing needs to be correct.
There was a panel at the NA FanFest, so I'm sure somebody can find it, that went over how they do voice acting. And honestly, it helped me understand why there's not more voice acting, because no matter how much voice acting they give us, they always say, like, this is the patch with the most voice acting ever. And the first thing that I get into the patch, and you wonder, you're like, why is it not all voice acted? You get into these big moments, you're like, oh, why was that not voice acted? Hildy, please, somebody call Nathan Fillion and just get Hildebrand voice acted. When they were talking about voice acting, they talked about exactly what he's saying here, this kind of final polish. and how they will have to have people from the different languages kind of in this meeting saying, well, in this language, I need this long to say the line in that particular scene. And then somebody else comes back and goes, no, that's way too long. We'll have already finished all of our lines, and now there's going to be this weird, awkward gap. So we only need this long, and then it has to go back and forth and back and forth. And so some of those cutscenes, you have no control over the pace at which the dialogue is. The dialogue's just voiced, and then there's just text appearing on the screen. If you don't read it fast enough, it kind of is what it is, because they want there to be really specific sounds at really specific moments. And that had to be filtered through every single language that the game is supported in, which is an immense amount of work. And so that panel, I think, even talked about how sometimes if they want to make a change to the way something was written, they may have to cut voice acting because the voices are recorded so far in advance. And so it almost seemed like, to keep this narrative content on time, it was really helpful that not every scene is voiced, because if they need to add detail or subtract detail from the story, that can all be done in the non-voiced scenes, because all they have to do is make changes to the text and the localization. They don't have to go back and go around the world and do all of this different voice acting in each of the languages.
The other very important element that I think people often overlook when they talk about the story is the flow of time. 14 Story, if you look at it again, a vacuum in a narrative perspective. If I tell you about the story of the Warrior of Light, everything from A Realm Reborn all the way to Endwalker, you would say, that's a good story. But you might not shed tears about it if I told you the story verbally. And why is that so? It's because if you think about the MSQs that you have played from A Realm Reborn to Endwalker, for many of us, it's something that has played out through many years. And if you are a veteran, up to a decade. And what does the flow of time actually lend to storytelling? It basically allows you to build out to the huge emotional payoff after so many years. It's pretty powerful stuff, because the problem that they set out in A Realm Reborn, the people that they make you care about, and the problems that they have to tackle, to see that all finally resolved after a long decade, that is some powerful stuff.
That is both powerful good and powerful bad. There are times that a veteran says that something has taken too long to play out, or they didn't like the way something pays off, and a new player goes, what are you talking about? So when we see, for example, veteran players say that they think A Realm Reborn is weaker than Heavensward, there are a lot of newer players that really enjoy A Realm Reborn. If we go look at this, for A Realm Reborn players, I was playing on a PlayStation 3 beginning in late 2013, and I was waiting 100 days per update. And so if there was something that didn't ring true, that was something that played out very slowly. And so when you look at the 661 days that somebody could have spent in A Realm Reborn, and you look at the 727 days that somebody could have spent inside Heavensward, you end up with timelines that, if somebody is frustrated, they could be frustrated for months on end, as opposed to a brand new player can start this, and some new players are literally through the first 1,400 days of the game, MSQ-wise, in a matter of weeks, months. They blow right through it. They get to a big moment, a big cliffhanger, and the person says, I'm going to need to look into this. Give me some time while I do. And then the quest ends and it says quest complete, and then you accept the next one. You don't have to wait that 100+ days in between. You just jump right in. And so there is a massive difference there that he's talking about with this time and how that makes it play out.
If you look at the MMORPG industry, expansions generally have their own storylines. However, I would argue that it's not as tight to the previous expansions and, the base game itself versus Final Fantasy XIV. Because you know it, I know it. The hardest part of convincing someone to play 14 is basically having them understand that the story is really long and they need to sink in many hours to basically play this game and appreciate the story. So that's the downside of kind of pursuing this strategy. But because they're one of the few who decide that they want to stay firm to this principle of having a long-standing story that they will not rush and slowly build up towards a high crescendo, the highs of the story are the highs that you pretty much have never experienced in a video game before because of the emotional investment.
So in a single player game, you could have multiple endings. You could have people die off versus not die off. You could have the player have a really profound impact on the world. And like once they destroy something, that could be pushed to a degree that like you could have whole buildings gone. And it can be pushed to a degree that MMOs simply can't. They have to consolidate us down to these milestones. And so there is an agency that cannot exist in MMOs. But what he's talking about as an advantage over single player games, right, in trade for not being able to have the degree of agency that a single player game can, is that an MMO can tell a story over a substantially larger scale. And so they have this unique ability to have more content inside of a single video game at any one time than any other genre can. Outside of just looking at like player created genres, when you start to look at like true sandbox games like Minecraft, there's nothing that can venture on like how broad an MMO is. So it is interesting that he's kind of brought up that their payoffs can be a great deal larger because they were able to build a lot more up to that point. The one downside of the way they've done it is they've made it mandatory. Their weaknesses are what he mentioned with like, it's hard to ask somebody to come in, because somebody who likes single player games is going to get out the far end of the story and go, I guess I'll see you guys later. And somebody who likes multiplayer games is going to go, you want me to do what now? And so it does require that somebody is kind of a mix of both to enjoy picking up Final Fantasy XIV today, clearing all the story, and then engaging in the raids and all the community events that take place at the end. So where he's built the strength is that he's mentioning that we can have a story payoff as the result of years of investing. But for that to truly be a payoff for all players, it has to be years of consistent quality consumption. So if you have a story skipper like myself for the first several years, once I skipped A Realm Reborn, I tried hopping back on in Heavensward because I was there at launch. I did not join A Realm Reborn until November. My friends were already waiting at max level. So I skipped so I could catch up and play with my friends. Then I decided to pick up the story in Heavensward, and I couldn't do it. So I skipped. And then I tried picking up the story in Stormblood, and I couldn't, so I skipped. So I tried to hop back on at each of these times, but it didn't make any sense. The first time you get exposed to a character that you've never met, they don't say, hi, I'm so-and-so, we haven't talked in a while. They just start talking, and you have no idea who they are or where they're from, as opposed to in Shadowbringers, where Yoshi P said, I'm aware there are some people who have kind of fallen off the story train. There are people who have bought skip potions. There are people who took a break from the game for a while, and the story is not something they're caught up on, because it is something that you're expected to remember a decade of story at the same time. And so he said in mid-2019, when Shadowbringers drops, I want to write this story in a way that somebody who doesn't remember all the story or doesn't know all the story could enjoy it also. So the downside of what Quazi's talking about is that it is a huge ask of the players. Obviously, the incredible payoff is amazing, but not everybody gets access to that huge payoff. There are a lot of people that at the very end of Endwalker, when they chose to use voice acting and not show faces, not everybody got all of those callbacks.
A good narrative combined with, I guess, the genius of musical composition, combined with the ability to build up the huge emotional payoff over many, many years, is a formula that is very hard to replicate and is something special. And so that's the first main point that I'd like to make in this video. I'm sure you've experienced in the MSQs, there are certain parts where maybe, the lighting of the scene isn't as great as the others because there's only limited lighting sources that they can place in the game. And I believe this is one of the things that Yoshipi covered during his 7.0 graphical upgrade producer live letter. He talked about the ability to add more lighting sources. Not only that, have you ever noticed that it seems that all the characters in a cutscene, they need to take their turns to speak. You can't have simultaneous audio flowing in a cutscene. That also to me is a limitation of the engine that they're currently working with. Yoshipi has said on a few occasions that it's really, really tough to make kind of custom animations with the engine they have. That is why Hildebrand is so expensive to make, because of all these fancy and wacky animations that they have to do.
So, ironically, that's also why Hildy was built in the first place. Hildebrand was first added to the game as a way of testing how they could do all these animations, but then players liked it, and players asked for more of it. And so Hildebrand is expensive, but the irony is that Hildebrand is kind of like how we get a lot of safety in our everyday driving cars because of the racing industry. Yes, it is immensely expensive, but the things that Hildebrand does for us trickle down into all of the brilliant animation that helps tell the story of things like Endwalker.
That is why we also took so many years to finally get a hugging scene all the way in Endwalker, because it's just very hard for them to kind of animate the character models to convey what they want in a cutscene. And I'm not saying that the 7.0 graphical upgrades will solve all of these problems. I'm just trying to point out the fact that even until today when we play the Endwalker MSQs, they are relying upon an infrastructure from so many years ago. But as gamers, we kind of think about the modern day games today and we try and benchmark Final Fantasy XIV's cutscenes versus what we see in the modern day engine.
The other thing to keep in mind is that this game runs really well on a very low minimum spec. And so, like, when we talk about restricting, also keep in mind that gameplay has to be restricted back to these minimum system requirements, which are very, very, very low. Some of these components, chat's saying, were released as far back as 2014. These are old systems. And that's because you don't want somebody who's maybe been increasing their system piecemeal or hasn't played an MMO in a while and wants to just hop back in and they haven't updated their machine in 4 or 5 years to feel like they're not welcome here. They are welcome. They may not have the experience they expected, but they will be able to log in at all. Yoshi P has also, as a completely separate point, talked about that he has had to make all sorts of choices because something has to be run through the art department, but also has to be allowed. So how do you render and show on screen a lot of things that could be misconstrued? And how do you give players emotes that could be used in ways they shouldn't be? And so to keep that T for teen rating has been heavily restrictive. So I know Quazi's examples are eating the apple, but that's not all animations are used for. We also have a lot of times that somebody like dies. And how do you deal with that? And to anybody that has seen all the emotes and adventure plates, just imagine that that's what already made it through their filter.
I think it's important to recognize that in order to build towards a crescendo in a story, you can't have high points at every single moment, because then it will nullify the idea that it's a high point, right? It's all relative. If one makes the argument of whether Endwalker's pacing could have been better, I think there was an interview done with Ishikawa, or is it Yoshipi, who mentioned that they initially intended for Endwalker's story to be split into 2 halves, like 2 different expansions. And so is pacing gonna suffer because of this compression? Maybe. All things considered, I think you would struggle to find another MMORPG with, like what I said, the different elements of the narrative, the music, the emotional payoff from the many years of emotional investment. It was really hard to find another MMO that basically combines all these 3.
That is a very well put argument right there. I've been doing a lot of these kind of responses lately to other games, and one of the things that I've really struggled with is when somebody's example is along the lines of, what makes this game unique is that it has dungeons. Like, to dumb it down, this idea that what makes it unique is that I enjoy their dungeons, but like every other game has dungeons. And so, like, what I appreciate here is that he said their unique advantage when combined is an immersive story told over many years that is married with good music. And like, that already means that any game that hasn't been around a long time, not eligible to beat them in this category. Any game that has been around a long time that has not chosen to be narrative based, not included in this. And so already we're down to like Old Republic, Star Wars Old Republic, and Final Fantasy. Like, we're already Guild Wars 2, and then marries music on top. And so by that point, like, if you just keep whittling down the total number of MMOs in the space, Final Fantasy might be the only game left standing.
14 MSQ experience, which is one of a kind in the MMORPG industry. And I 100% recognize that there are single player titles out there with really good storylines as well. But keep in mind, they're working within the confines of the MMORPG space. There's certain structures, like I said, classes, jobs, leveling processes that other single player titles don't have to deal with. So pacing is also at the mercy of those things I've mentioned. But you know what? At the end of the day, this is a very interesting topic to me because I've always tried to ponder and think about why is it that 14's MSQ is something so special that even after the MSQs have ended, people talk about it on a daily basis.
Thank you, Quasi. Absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I didn't know where that was going to go with the post. As a longtime story skipper that's now been doing the story, I wasn't quite sure where it was going to go from here. But I think there's some interesting points there. And like, if you try to break down like the 5 reasons to play Final Fantasy XIV, and point number 1 is story, he did a great job of breaking down what makes this story so special. It always came first in the dev cycle. That doesn't mean that you can't like the game for things that came after it. But story is a very hard thing to do retroactively. And so the narrative has to come first as far as just the order of operations, even if for one particular player it's not the most important. So the fact that it is a narratively based MMO gives it an opportunity for story to be a really important part of why you might play Final Fantasy XIV. That story is also long running. One of the frustrations with some of the other big MMOs in the room is if they feel like that story is fragmented, then it loses some of its value in their mind. So the fact that it is one cohesive campaign all the way through and that you get to experience 10 years of highs and lows is amazing. And then the fact that when you play it as a video game, they acknowledge that it's a video game and they use music to add immersion to it on top. That starts to really build. If I were to go and try to come at this from the other direction and say, what do I think makes story really hard for people to like about Final Fantasy XIV? Because I think he hit all the strengths very, very, very well. I would say, first of all, the fact that it is 100% mandatory. By making it mandatory, you run the risk of somebody saying, I want to try this game, but to decide if it's for me, I want to get to the PvP. And so they end up skipping some quests as they get close to level 30 so they can do the thing they're here for. And you can mock whether or not the reason they're here is valid, but if they just want to try something out, they should be able to do that. If they want to try crafting and gathering, or they want to get to their very first raid boss at level 50, anything in the way of that isn't fun. And you saying, but it's good, doesn't make it fun. It doesn't magically make it fun. So the fact that it is so mandatory and that there is no point in the game that they do a previously on or a catch up or a good meaningful summary, and that no expansion with the exception of Shadowbringers is written for somebody to have a chance to have a potential on-ramp, that means if somebody ends up not liking A Realm Reborn, they can't just start with Heavensward. People say, oh, start with Heavensward, it gets so much better. You are going to be really lost on a lot of things in Heavensward because it picks up off of the exact zones where A Realm Reborn takes place. I would say that making it non-skippable is a bit of a weakness because Guild Wars, I've had a chance to go in and play the way I want. I just got my Skyscale, I'm super pumped. And now I can go back and do Living Season 1 if I want. As opposed to if story was mandatory and all I want is my Skyscale, now I rush to my Skyscale and I can't really go back. So I really think that they could improve on that. A lot of that could be done through the New Game Plus system continuing to be beefed up because there's some replayability. I think some basics like giving alternate classes some fraction of experience for doing it, even if it doesn't reward Gil and the experience is a fraction of what it was. I think you could also go in and start to build in reasons to replay it. So giving people different choices. Right now you can't re-choose your starting city. Some of the dialogue options throughout some of the stuff like Praetorium have been removed. And so giving people a little bit of agency there. Like in Endwalker, there's a scene where you get to choose who to speak with at a particular point. That's really cool. And when you go back through, you might go, I'm going to pick something different. So more things like that, giving that replayability and maybe tying an achievement to each one of those. So it kind of invites people to go back and do that. And then maybe mess with the difficulties. We already, if you fail a single player scenario, have the ability to scale those down. What if we went the other way? We scaled them up just a little bit, just kind of like an extreme version of those, so that as you play through the gameplay portion of it could be really rewarding for a long-time player who's effectively going to be in super overpowered synced gear and maybe even know their class. Let's give them something. Let's give them something a little bit meaningful. I think that'd be really cool. The second component of what I think makes Final Fantasy XIV's story struggle just a little bit, when I think about a story or lore or narrative, I think about the source material. I think that there is a lot of great narrative within Final Fantasy XIV. At this point, I've experienced all but Stormblood MSQ. I'm almost done with all of the side content for Heavensward, and then I'm going to start Stormblood. I'll wrap up through all the Stormblood stuff, and then I will have made a full lap since I started in Shadowbringers. As I get close to having wrapped it up, I think the source material has been nothing short of incredible. But there are times that the video game Final Fantasy XIV Online does not do the best possible job of reflecting the source material as a video game. So when you're playing a video game, you're playing a video game. You're not sitting back on your couch with popcorn in your seat. You have a controller in your hands or a keyboard in front of you. You maybe have headphones on. And so there is something about it that mimics playing a video game. And so that means that when we move into sections like the beginning of Endwalker, where you do not have a meaningful amount of combat for pretty close to 2 hours, that's not a good video game. It's a great story, but it's not a good video game, because I play games to play games. That might be my own personal opinion, but I like playing video games when I'm playing video games. And I'm not trying to say that in a way that demeans. I don't know how to say that better, but like, that's what I like about it. And so when you're in these single player scenarios and they're talking to you while you're running through something, or there's voiceover over a dungeon, those are really awesome. And so I think there are times that, without trying to spoil anything, an optional dungeon in Heavensward is Dusk Vigil, which does mean, since it's optional, it will not be supported by the duty support system as it sits right now. When you look at that dungeon, there is some optional lore hidden within the text on the ground. You walk through the dungeon and there's some pieces of paper that you can click on, and when you click on them, there's text. And I went through with 2 people from stream and 1 random person. And when I was clicking on those, the other random person, who didn't know that my tank and my healer were with me, said, "Why are you clicking on those? You should come back in Explorer mode and do that on your own time." That text massively alters what you view in the dungeon. And so reading the text as you go, with the combat that ensues, is a wildly different experience than clearing the dungeon, knowing what the final boss is, and then going back and reading. This is why we have non-skippable cutscenes in Praetorium, because of that person's mentality, because we can't be trusted to be civil to each other. It masterfully changed that. A better way of telling that story, with the mechanics of video games at your disposal and the same source material, would have been to have, as you ran by those texts, to have those texts maybe have an animation where it fluttered into the wind, and then there was subtitled voiceover as you ran through the dungeon. All things within Final Fantasy XIV's technical capabilities, not how they chose to do it. And so that would have been something where I did not have to hold that other person back, and I would have had the exact same story. But instead, there had to be friction, where one player wanted to clear their dungeon very quickly. I totally respect that. I wanted to slow down and enjoy the lore. Obviously, I respect that. And we were not able to satisfy each other's way of playing without creating friction. And that is something that Final Fantasy XIV does time and time again. They could be a lot better about making the game less about constantly stopping and reading, and more about how do we tell this story as you move. Endwalker has made massive leaps into doing this with their escort system, where we have these moments, and originally it was portrayed that a lot of them would be optional, a lot more than were optional. But as you move through, knowing where the optional ones are, knowing where the main ones are, starts to create this hierarchy of, I just want to get through it, and that starts to tell these big moments. And there are these optionals for the people that want to dive a little deeper, this almost like plus sign side quest type moments. And so I think there's a lot of really cool stuff that they're moving towards, but as it sits, the video game is not always the best video game that could be made with the same source material as a game goes. When they're talking about these different conflicts, I love when they can have me do a flashback and I can be in that conflict. When we go back in the Monk quest line and we hear about some of these major story moments that he tells us about from before we were playing the game, from before Realm Reborn. He's catching us up on old history. Instead of just making that something What I'm talking about right now is inside of talking to a quest giver and clicking on optional quest text. It is not even something that's presented to all players that clear the monk storyline. It is something that is optionally engaged in, and that should be a chance to go play that scenario. Obviously, I'm spending infinite Square Enix dollars while doing this, but it's something that I think, as they talk about sparing no expense, I would love to see a little bit more of that. And honestly, I think there's seeds to believe that we're going to get that. I believe I'm reasonably predicting the future because Shadowbringers has a little bit, Endwalker has more of it. And so it feels like we're already moving that direction. It's just something that I would want to champion them doing even more of. And the last thing is just gatekeeping. That's it. It's the community can absolutely be champions of the story and be proud of the story and be thrilled with the story. That's amazing. But I think that sometimes it's easy to get to the point where, because the story was meaningful to you, it now has to be to everybody else. And that's just not true. You don't have to like the story to like Final Fantasy XIV. And so when people pick up the game, if we're going to list the 5 reasons to play Final Fantasy XIV, and story is one of them, I do think it is fair to acknowledge that if somebody wants to play for the other 4 reasons, whatever they may be, that 4 reasons is more than enough reasons to enjoy playing a video game. So I don't know where this like desire to, if you don't like the story, it takes away from my enjoyment of the story comes from, or if you don't take away from the story, this dev team that has been nothing but passionate about the story is suddenly going to stop caring about it. I don't know where this defensiveness of it comes from, but just let people enjoy video games. It's just a video game. It's all a way of wasting time. It's all a way of doing something that is meaningful but not meaningful. It means something to us, but ultimately it doesn't. It's just a game. It's just a game. And that's a good thing, that it can be just a game. It is just meant to be there to brighten your day, to make your life a little bit better. And as long as it's doing that, and in so doing so, you didn't have to like make somebody else's day worse, you're doing it right. Which ironically means that the people who try to defend story to the point that they are pushing others out of the game are doing it wrong. It is weird to me that in a narrative-based MMO, one of the handful of things that the community does that is not very nice is when a fringe portion of the community decides to vocally push somebody else out because they don't like story. That means the problem's you, because the right way to play an MMORPG is to play the way you enjoy, but not hurt somebody else. And I think when you say that, that sounds really logical across the board. But for some reason, when somebody then critiques the story, that's where people get really offended, and you just gotta let that go. You just gotta let that go. Welcome people in their journey. If they want to come into, ultimate number 5 and they want to hang out and stream and they ask a question about the story and you say, you haven't done the story, then get out of stream. I have literally seen that, and I wish I had something to show on screen here to prove it. That's gotta stop. And so that's the last thing about story, is just a, this idea that somebody who doesn't play the story isn't welcome. As somebody that received it for a number of years and kept playing anyway, it doesn't feel good. And I would never want to see somebody kicked from the game because they play a lot of hours and don't touch Savage. I would never want to see somebody hit max level and say that they love how complete they feel with the game, but they've never touched crafting and gathering. I would never want to see anybody pushed out for not engaging in any of Final Fantasy XIV's amazing systems. Invite those people to those systems, sure, but if they don't want to do them, that's okay. And that includes story. Remember, story is a very small fraction of the number of hours we play in this game. It's a narrative-based game, so it's something we talk about a lot. But the amount of percent of time we talk about it compared to actually percent of time doing it, it's a very small portion of why people stay subscribed day in and day out when you look at your actual actions. So we've got to chill out on that.